By the time Selka Vey heard the first bell, she was already standing where no sane person should stand after dark. The wreck of Relay Tower 9 rose out of the salt flats like a black needle hammered into the dead basin, all rust, ladders, and dangling cable whips singing in the wind. Beneath it stretched the hollow sea. Not water anymore, not for years, but a white, endless plain of mineral crust, drowned ship hulls, rotted piers, and old harbor lights that sometimes blinked in places where no power should have remained. The air out there always tasted wrong. Dry as bone, sharp with salt and iron and old storms. Selka stood on the top maintenance cage with one gloved hand resting on the tower frame and listened. The bell rang again. Low. Far out in the basin. A slow iron note rolling over the flats like something dragged up from memory instead of metal. Her black horns, swept back from her temples in smooth dark arcs, caught the moonlight with a dull shine. Frosty white salt had settled along their edges during the climb. Her skin, deep ocean blue, almost midnight in the dark, stood out against the pale dead sea like a wound. Wind pulled at the short braids tucked behind one ear and tugged the collar of her patched coat tighter around her throat. Below, the settlement of Rakefall crouched behind its scrap fence and tired generators, every yellow lamp looking small and temporary against the black waste beyond. Selka didn't move. She had learned long ago that the hollow sea punished quick decisions. The bell came a third time. Then the dead radio behind her crackled to life. She spun so fast the wrench at her belt slapped against the cage rail. The relay console had been dark for 6 years. Everybody in Rakefall knew that. The upper mast still caught weather charge, and the lower grounding lines still hummed in storms, but the long-range speaker had not spoken since the old coast roads closed and the inland companies stopped pretending the West still mattered. Now a single green status light glowed on the panel. Static hissed from the speaker. Then a voice, shredded by interference and distance, clawed its way through. Anyone receiving, answer the bell, for God's sake, answer. Selka stared. The line snapped dead again. For half a second she simply stood there with wind beating at her coat and the impossible still hanging in the cage with her. Then she dropped to her knees and ripped the front panel off the relay with both hands. "Come on," she muttered. "Come on." She knew old machinery the way some people knew prayer, by habit, resentment, and the certainty that being gentle never improved the results. Copper filaments. Half-fused couplers. Cracked ceramic spacers. A salvage-patched amplifier coil she herself had jury-rigged 4 years earlier for a weather scan that never paid out. She moved fast, fingers sure despite the cold. Below, the settlement had begun to react. Doors opening. Voices rising. Someone shouting, was that the tower? Selka ignored all of it. The voice had come from the sea. That meant one of two things. Someone was alive out there. Or something wanted her to think so. Neither option sat lightly. By the time she climbed down from the relay, half of Rakefall was awake. The main lane had filled with lanterns and anxious faces. Dogs barked. A generator coughed and surged near the machine shed. Children peered from behind adults' coats until they were pushed back indoors. In a small place built on shortage, anything unusual spread faster than fire. Selka crossed through them without slowing. People stepped aside. Some because she moved like purpose made flesh when she was in a mood. Some because the sight of a blue-skinned woman with black horns striding down a dust lane under a Dead Sea moon still caused an old reflexive caution in people who had spent most of their lives around sameness. Not hatred, mostly. Not anymore. But not ease either. She was used to that. Inside the machine shed, heat from the welding stove clung to the air. The place smelled of grease, burnt wire, hot metal, and old fuel, the closest thing to comfort Selka had found in years. Engine housings hung on chains from roof beams. Tires, axles, cracked manifolds, stripped circuit boards, water pumps, coil boxes, and salvage bins crowded every wall. At the center workbench, already waiting for her, stood Jonah Wren with his sleeves rolled and his expression set halfway between concern and annoyance. "You heard it," Selka said. Jonah gave her a dry look. "Hard not to." Half the settlement thought judgment had finally gotten organized. He was taller than her by half a head, broad through the chest from years of lifting engine blocks, with a face the dry wind had carved lines into before his age had earned them. He had the rough hands of a mechanic and the patient eyes of someone forced by circumstance to become calmer than his nature preferred. Selka liked that he rarely stared at her horns. He had known her too long for that. "The relay lit up," she said. "Voice on the line. Asked someone to answer the bell." Jonah went still. "Not dramatically. Just enough." "From the basin?" "Yes." "Clean signal?" "No." "Broken?" "Enough." Jonah exhaled through his nose and looked toward the shed doors as if he could already see the argument racing down the lane toward them. It arrived seconds later. The council did not come as a body. It came as pressure in pieces: old Brenner Holt from the water board, thin as wire and twice as abrasive, Sister Nema from the infirmary with her satchel and hard steady gaze. And Rourke Dane, who had somehow become chief of Rakefall by surviving longer and speaking less foolishly than most men with access to transport rigs. Rourke filled the doorway first and the room second, heavy-shouldered, gray-bearded, and calm in a way that often made people mistake him for gentle until they saw what happened when he was forced to stop being either. "Tell at once," he said. So Selka did. The bell. The radio. The voice. She did not embellish. She did not need to. When she finished, the welding stove popped softly in the silence. Brenner folded his arms. "Could be atmospheric artifact." Jonah snorted. "Artifact asking for help by name?" "I didn't say help by name," Selka said. "I said it said answer the bell." Brenner frowned. "That's worse." No one argued. Everyone in the inland settlements knew the old stories of the Hollow Sea. Not because they believed them all, but because dead coastlines bred stories the way wetwood bred mold. Bells ringing where no ships floated. Harbor lights in the salt haze. Voices on dry radios. Raiders moving over the basin at night on skids and chain rigs. Whole convoys gone between one dawn and the next because the crust looked solid where it wasn't. And deeper than those newer stories, older ones. That before the sea died there had been machines under it. That the western ports had tried to save themselves with engines too large and costly to fail politely. That when the water vanished, something underneath kept listening. Rourke looked at Selka. "Can you get the relay fully online? Enough to catch the signal again? Can you track it?" "Maybe." She shrugged one shoulder. "If the Dead Sea is feeling cooperative." "It never is," Jonah said. Sister Nema's mouth tightened. "If someone is really alive out there. We can't ignore it," Rourke finished. Brenner made a noise like old paper tearing. "We can, and probably should." Selka turned to him. "You volunteering to tell the settlement we left people to die because the sea told a scary story?" "I'm volunteering to remind everyone that scary stories often contain survival advice." Jonah leaned both hands on the bench. "And if it's not a story?" Brenner looked at him, at Selka, at Rourke, and seemed to realize simultaneously that the decision was already leaving without his permission. He swore under his breath. Rourke nodded once. At first light, one rig. Selka for route and radio. Jonah for machine support. Nema for survivors. "I'm coming. We verify the signal and bring back whoever's left." Selka's jaw tightened. She had expected the mission. She had not expected herself to be calm about it. The truth was uglier. She knew the western road better than anyone in Rakefall because she had once belonged to the coast. Not to Port Mercy, where the signal likely came from, but near enough for the dead harbor names to live in her bones. Before Rakefall. Before salvage work. Before she became the settlement's best mechanic by refusing to let anything stay broken long enough to kill people. Before that there had been Blackwater Reach, a fishing town on the northern curve of the sea, where her mother painted tide charts and her father argued with anyone richer than him. There had been salt wind and rusted docks and gulls and a line of black boats rocking in real waves. There had been a brother who laughed too easily and a harbor bell that marked fog and storm and safe return. Then the sea pulled back. The fish died. The contracts changed. The coast became a market for desperation, and desperation always invited men with ledgers and guns. By the time Selka was 17, Blackwater had sold its docks, its pumps, and eventually its people. She had left in a crawler convoy with 3 families and 1 bag of tools while the bell rang behind her and nobody stayed safe enough to answer it. She had not gone back. Now the Dead Sea had spoken first. That was the sort of insult the world enjoyed. The bell rang again just before dawn. This time Selka was ready. She had spent the night on the relay tower with a portable battery bank, new copper windings, an old phase regulator, and the kind of focus that turned fear into procedure. Below, Rakefall slept badly. No one admitted they were listening for the next bell, everyone listened anyway. When it came rolling over the flats, the panel lit clean green from end to end. Selka thumbed the mic. Unknown transmitter, this is Rakefall Relay 9. Repeat, this is Rakefall Relay 9. Identify. Static flooded the speaker. A burst of tones. Then a woman's voice, weak but unmistakably real. Survey vessel Celandine, stranded. Port Mercy Inner Harbor, engine dead. Being circled after dark, if anyone hears this, answer the bell. Selka's mouth went dry. Port Mercy. Jonah, climbing into the cage with a thermos in one hand, heard the last word and froze. Tell me I misheard that. She keyed the mic again. Celandine, say again. Survivors count. The line flared, dipped, and crackled. 8 alive, 1 broken leg, 1 fever, Bellers in the outer basin. The speaker went dead. Jonah looked out over the widening flats toward the west, where the first light was turning the Dead Sea into a sheet of pale silver. Of course it's Bellers, he said softly. Why would it ever be simple? Selka didn't answer. Because Port Mercy mattered for another reason too. It was close. Too close to one place she had spent years trying not to think about. The Mercy Underworks, her father used to call them when drink had softened him into storytelling. Old maintenance tunnels under the harbor. Pump galleries. Floodgates. Rail conduits. He always said the coast wasn't just built on salt and concrete. It was built over a sleeping machine the rich had tried to harness and failed to bury. At 12, Selka thought that was pirate talk. At 31, with a dead radio whispering from a vanished sea, she was less sure. By sunrise the crawler stood fueled outside the machine shed. It had once hauled ore and drilling cores for one of the inland companies before somebody smarter than the company sold it cheap with half its systems dying. Selka had rebuilt enough of it to make it loyal. 6 broad wheels. Reinforced belly plates. Intake filters triple-layered against salt dust. Side mesh over the cabin glass. Rear platform chained for cargo and passengers. The engine coughed like a long-time smoker but pulled like stubbornness given gears. She checked it herself, one palm on the warm engine casing as if greeting an animal before a difficult road. Jonah loaded spare belts, seal kits, line hooks, and 2 tool chests. Rourke brought rifles and a shotgun. Sister Nima brought medicine, water, and the kind of silence people trusted when things went wrong fast. No speeches. No promises. The settlement gathered anyway. Lanterns. Scarves. Faces pale with dust and bad imagination. A little girl from the south lane stepped forward suddenly and pressed a tin charm into Selka's hand before her mother dragged her back, flustered and apologizing. Selka looked down. It was a tiny bell cut from scrap sheet, painted blue. For luck. Something in her chest moved in a direction she did not care to name. She tucked it into her coat and climbed into the driver's seat. They rolled west. The first kilometers passed under a low gray morning with wind pushing dust in long strips over the track. Extraction rigs stood abandoned along the edge fields like giant dead insects, their pump heads frozen in mid-bow. Storage tanks leaned. Pipework buckled. Company signs rattled at intersections, their warnings half sandblasted away, subsurface hazard. Gas event zone. Authorized haul only. Jonah, in the passenger seat, watched the horizon through the side mesh and drank bad coffee from a metal flask. You slept? Selka asked. He made a noncommittal noise. That means no. That means enough to remain decorative. She almost smiled. Behind them, through the partition hatch, Rourke and Nima spoke quietly about rations and triage. Their voices mixed with engine rumble and the constant small percussion of loose bolts somewhere in the rear frame. The road ended by noon. The hollow sea began without ceremony. Brown hardpan became pale salt crust and then widened into a white immensity that reflected the sky with such brightness Selka had to drop the cabin visor halfway. No water. No sound of surf. Only the mineral crunch under the crawler's tires and the occasional deep booming from pressure ridges settling far away under the basin crust. Old ships dotted the flats at impossible angles. A trawler half buried nose first, mast sticking up from salt like a grave marker. A ferry terminal roof with no walls around it. A line of channel buoys, each one mummified in crystal bloom and leaning where currents had once held them straight. Jonah looked through the glass and said softly, "I'll never get used to this." Selka did not answer. Because she knew what should be there. Wind over dark water. The glint of real harbor lights. Because memory is cruelest when the world erases its own proof and leaves yours intact. The sinkfield found them mid-afternoon. No warning worth naming. 1 second the crawler rolled steady over white crust, the next the front right wheel punched through with a crack like rifle fire and the whole machine lurched nose down toward black brine mud hidden beneath. Selka killed the throttle instantly. Out. They moved fast. Rourke was already off the rear rail before the cab stopped rocking. Jonah grabbed the winch line and plate mats. Nima hauled the emergency tools without being asked. White powder hissed into the fracture around the trapped wheel, widening as the crust settled. Another meter and the axle would go. For 40 brutal minutes they dug, hauled, cursed, and winched under a sun that turned the basin glare into punishment. Selka crawled under the front frame twice to fit the brace plates while brine sucked at her boots and salt dust caked the sweat on her blue skin pale as frost. Jonah took a cut across his palm from a snapped cable strand and wrapped it without comment. Rourke nearly lost his footing when the mooring post shifted. Nima swore at all three of them in tones that stripped sentiment cleanly from rescue work. At last the crawler climbed free in a spray of white crust and black slurry. They stood breathing hard around it, ghosted to the knees in salt. Jonah wiped his mouth and said, "How many more of those before Port Mercy?" Selka looked west. The horizon shimmered. Enough. They drove on. Toward dusk the first ruins of the harbor line emerged from the basin haze. A customs pylon. The rib cage of a warehouse roof. A dead weather vane spinning over nothing. And then, rising enormous and broken from the flats below, Port Mercy itself. Even empty, it had scale enough to feel like accusation. The harbor bowls had become white mineral basins ringed with cracked quays and skeletal cranes. Apartment blocks leaned over dead marinas. Container yards sat fossilized under drifts. Floodgates stood open to nothing. Rail tracks ended in salt. The central weather spire, blackened and split near the crown, still pierced the skyline like a snapped spear. And on Pier 9, near the inner harbor, a signal mast blinked. Green. Red. Green. There, Jonah said. Selka had already seen the movement around it through the windshield. People. Small figures shifting between cargo housings and burn barrels. Alive. And beyond them, where the outer harbor met the lower sink channels, something else moved. Not men on foot. Not ordinary rigs. A ship hull plated in dark scrap iron gliding over the basin on hidden runners, lights slit low behind armor shutters. A bell hung from its bow. Selka's hands tightened on the wheel. Jonah saw it a heartbeat later. Tell me that's not a beller ship. It's a beller ship. Wonderful. Behind them, Nima leaned forward. Can we reach the survivors before full dark? Selka measured the distance, the dead harbor grid, the likely sink lanes, the speed of the black ship weaving through the old channel road, and the simple ugly fact that night on the basin belonged to people who chose to live there. No, she said. Not safely. Rourke grunted from the rear bench. Then we do it unsafely. The signal mast flashed faster. Hurry. Selka looked once at the dying light over Port Mercy, once at the black ship moving in the outer basin, and drove down the access slope anyway. Night in the dead harbor arrived in layers. First the upper windows blackened. Then the spaces under the cranes filled. Then the white basin stopped reflecting and became void. Selka killed the crawler's headlamps before entering the terminal district and let the machine roll on low engine and moonlight, guided by old maps in her head and the blinking signal on Pier 9. The city was louder than it should have been. Loose cables tapping steel. Hanging signs knocking against one another. Salt crust settling off rooftops. Somewhere distant, a chain dragging across concrete and then going still when they did. Jonah lowered the side mesh for a clearer shot line. I hate this already. Your standards remain impressively stable, Selka murmured. They reached Pier 9 at full dark. The survivors came out with lanterns and weapons held low. 8 of them. 6 crew, 1 limping engineer, and a captain with a bandaged calf and the kind of face that had learned command by having no one else available to do it. She introduced herself as Captain Elian Voss of the survey vessel Celandine. 3 nights earlier, she explained in clipped exhausted bursts, they had crossed a shelf in the inner harbor that collapsed under their rear skids. They'd limped to Pier 9 on one functional drive, barricaded in the cargo housings, and begun ringing the old harbor bell after finding maintenance notes that suggested the basin relays sometimes woke to mechanical resonance. And the radio answered? Jonah asked. Voss nodded. Not the first night. The second. Her expression tightened. And something else answered first. Selka didn't like the shape of that sentence. Who's circling you? Rourke asked. Voss looked out into the dark. Bellers. Since the bell rang. More every night. No one wasted time after that. Loading began immediately. Fuel drums siphoned from the Celandine, hard cases of survey data, 1 feverish deckhand half-carried, 1 engineer with a splinted arm, blankets, rations, water tanks, 2 boxes of spare instrumentation Voss refused to leave behind with the almost religious focus of someone who knew exactly what they were worth. Selka kept scanning the harbor while she worked. The bells had changed. Not random now. Moving. 1 from the outer basin. 1 from the customs hull. 1 from the breakwater beyond the ferry lanes. Signals. Not just lures. Faster, she said. As if obeying, every bell in Port Mercy rang at once. The sound rolled through the dead city in a single iron wave. Then engines answered from the dark. Lights flared between grounded hulls. Small runner rigs cut through the lower channels. Shapes moved under the old floodgates. From somewhere beyond the terminal yards came the groan of something large shifting on metal rails. "Go!" Rourke barked. Selka was already in the cab. The crawler engine caught on the first turn and she threw it forward just as the first raider skiff burst from a side lane under a fan of white salt dust. The driver wore oilskins and a face wrap. The passenger swung a hooked line toward the crawler's rear platform. Jonah shot him through the shoulder before the hook landed. The skiff slewed sideways. Another replaced it instantly. Rourke opened up with the shotgun from the rear rail, blasting glass out of the second raider's front shield. Nima, who had no interest in performing delicacy under pressure, shoved two survivors flat and started binding down cargo with one hand while firing a sidearm with the other whenever anything got too close. Selka drove. The dead harbor routes lived in her body deeper than thought. Customs road left. Fuel lane right. Drain trench by the cannery. Hidden ramp past the dry fish market. She hadn't been here in 14 years and still the turns arrived under her hands before memory could finish naming them. Left. Voss shouted from the side seat. "I know. You were heading for a collapsed rail. I know where it collapsed." That silenced Voss long enough to earn a startled sideways glance. A shot shattered the side mirror near Selka's horn. Salt sprayed through the mesh. Jonah shouted something rude at the dark and fired back through the broken frame. They hit the freight district at speed. Container stacks loomed up into canyon walls. The crawler's suspension screamed. A raider rig flipped in pursuit and vanished under its own trailing sled in a shower of sparks. For one glorious impossible moment Selka thought they might actually break through. Then the black ship slid across the avenue ahead. It moved over buried harbor rails under its armored belly with all the patient confidence of something entering a stage it owned. Scrap plate. Rusted ribs. Slit lamps. Bells swinging from the bow. Along the foredeck stood armed silhouettes in patched oilskins and chainmail scavenged from old dock rigging. At their center, one woman. Long coat. White streaked hair tied back hard from a face weathered into sharpness rather than age. One hand resting on the bell rope, the other on the stock of a mounted harpoon gun. When she smiled, it looked like she was humoring an old story. "Selka Vey," she called over the avenue with terrible easy clarity. "Well. The coast sends one of its lost daughters home." Selka felt her stomach go cold. Jonah glanced at her sharply. "You know her?" "Know of her. Everyone near the Hollow Sea knew Maud Saren. Bell captain. Salt queen. Raider saint if you were drunk enough. She ran the largest beller fleet on the basin and claimed toll over half the dead harbor lanes. People said she could smell working fuel from a kilometer and remember a face after one glance in a storm. Apparently that last one was true. Maud laid one hand fondly on the hanging bell. "You answer my sea," she said. "You pay my toll." Rourke leaned out from the rear rail. "Come take it." Maud's smile deepened by a blade's width. "Gladly." The harpoon gun fired. The bolt punched through the crawler's side mesh, tore across the cab roof, and anchored in a supply crate on the rear platform with a brutal clang. The attached chain snapped tight. The whole crawler jerked backward. Selka hit the throttle so hard the engine roared. For one impossible second the machine hung between forces, wheels spinning, chain shrieking, frame twisting under strain. Jonah swore and grabbed the dash. Survivors screamed in the rear compartment. Then Selka saw the switch ramp. A half-collapsed cargo exit climbing beside the blocked avenue toward the upper terminal roofs. Too narrow for Maud's ship. Too steep for sane freight traffic. Good enough. "Hold on," she snapped. What are you doing? Voss shouted. Being unreasonable. She cut the wheel hard left and drove. The crawler hit the ramp on an angle that should have killed it. The rear wheels lifted. The chain snapped taut enough to sing. Metal screamed. Then the left side railing on the ramp sheared off under the black ship's pull, showering rust and bolts. The chain whipped free with a report like thunder. The crawler shot upward. A raider leaning in from a side platform caught the rail, reached for the rear cargo line, and would have made it too if Jonah hadn't leaned out the broken side mesh and smashed his face with a tire iron hard enough to drop him into the dark. The crawler crested the ramp on two wheels, slammed back down, and tore into the upper terminal district with the whole cab shaking. Behind them, Maud Saren's bell rang once. Not angry. Amused. Selka hated that more than rage. They didn't stop until the city was a black ruin behind them and the basin road opened into white emptiness under moonlight. Even then she kept the crawler at punishing speed until Rourke's hand thumped the cab wall. Enough, he called. You break the axle, we all walk. Reluctantly, Selka eased off. Engine noise dropped from scream to growl. Inside the rear compartment, the survivors rediscovered breath. Nima moved through them with medicine and orders. Jonah sat back in the passenger seat, salt in his hair and blood at one knuckle, grinning in the tired shocked way men do after surviving something they had already privately buried themselves in. Voss unrolled her survey maps across the dash with hands that still shook. Selka glanced at them. What mattered enough to bring under fire? Voss hesitated. Then she tapped a line of marks across the basin. We weren't only surveying deformation, she said. Nobody in the cab looked surprised. 3 months ago, Voss went on, one of the inland reclamation boards detected repeating pressure shifts under the western crust. Not gas pockets. Not sink migration. Rhythmic. Structured. Her finger moved to a cluster of circles beneath the old harbor channels. There are voids under Port Mercy. Huge ones. Artificial chambers tied into the pre-collapse harbor system. Selka felt every muscle in her neck tighten. Jonah's voice lost its humor. You're saying the underworks are real? Voss looked at her. Not Jonah. At her. You've heard of them. Selka kept her eyes on the white road ahead. My father talked too much when he drank. Rourke leaned forward from the rear partition. What underworks? Voss took a breath. The original tidal engine network. Thermal pumps. Pressure chambers. Atmospheric exchangers. The coast tried to stabilize salinity and weather with them before the sea collapse. Her mouth tightened. We think something down there is reactivating. Silence in the cab. Out on the basin, far behind them, a bell rang again. Selka heard it differently now. Not only as a lure. As a marker. A timing pulse. Voss continued, quieter. Maud Saren knows. Or suspects. Her people searched the lower harbor channels before they focused on us. If she reaches the engine access first. She didn't finish. She didn't need to. Anyone who controlled old water systems in the inland wastes controlled more than weather. Pressure gates. Aquifer routing. Reservoir release. Bargaining power over every settlement west of the ridge. The Dead Sea had been empty long enough for people to forget how quickly water turned from resource into throne. Selka drove through the rest of the night with that thought sitting between her shoulders like a knife. They reached Rake Fall by mid-morning. This return drew more than relief. It drew fear. The settlement saw the extra survivors, the survey maps, the salt-streaked crawler, the blood and soot and the expression on Selka's face, and understood immediately that whatever had happened on the basin had made the future worse before it improved anybody's present. The wounded went to Nima's infirmary. Fuel was counted. Water redistributed. Voices rose in the council hall before noon. By dusk all of Rakefall knew three things. First, the radio signal had been real. Second, Maud Saran and the Bellers were moving in organized numbers through Port Mercy. Third, something under the Dead Sea, some old machine system everyone sensible had reduced to campfire myth, was waking. The council argument lasted hours. "Leave it," said Brenner. "Seal the West Road. Cut the relay. Let the harbor eat itself." "Impossible," said Voss. The bells had already reached inland frequency. If the engine network came online uncontrolled, it might crack extraction fields, reroute brine pressure, or draw corporate recovery teams down on every settlement in range. "Then let the companies come," someone shouted bitterly from the back. "Maybe soldiers bring food." Rourke crushed that line of thought with one look. Selka stood near the rear wall of the hall and listened until her own name surfaced 3 times in 1 minute. That was enough. She stepped forward. The room quieted. She hated that too. Maybe because it reminded her that being visibly different made silence easier to command and harder to trust. "Maud isn't ringing bells for sport," she said. "She's mapping responses. Testing roads. If she thinks the underworks are real, she won't stop at tolling the basin. She'll take the harbor, then the access, then whatever she can make the inland settlements pay to keep or shut down." Brenner glared. "And you know her intentions now?" Selka looked at him coldly. "I know coast predators. They didn't go extinct when the fish did." No one laughed. Voss spread her maps wider on the council table. "There are at least 3 probable under-harbor entry points left accessible. One under the Weather Spire Annex, one below Floodgate 4, one in the Customs Rail Tunnel." Her finger moved along the lines. "If we move before Maud does, we can confirm what's active and either secure or destroy it." "Destroy a pre-collapse engine network?" Brenner said. "With what?" Rourke answered before Voss could. "Charges if needed. Labor if not. We're not preserving a machine that gives pirates a claim on weather." All eyes shifted to Selka. Not because she was chief. Not because she had asked for this. Because everyone knew she knew the coast better than the room did. Because she had driven them through the harbor alive. Because old grief and practical competence often got mistaken for authority. Jonah, from the side wall, folded his arms and said, "If she goes, I go." Nima did not bother waiting to be asked. "You'll need someone to keep idiots alive underground." Rourke grunted. "Good. Then we leave at dawn." Selka did not object. Later, alone in the machine shed, she did allow herself 1 minute of fury. Not dramatic. Not loud. She simply stood with both hands braced on the crawler hood until the metal cooled beneath her palms and the rage passed through into something steadier. Jonah found her there. He carried 2 mugs of bad tea and set one beside her without comment. For a while they listened to the settlement outside, late voices, one barking dog, a hammer somewhere down the lane, Rakefall trying to pretend routine could still contain what it had learned. "You knew Port Mercy before?" Jonah asked eventually. Selka stared at the crawler's scarred hood. "Passed through. Traded there once. Not often." "That all?" "No." He waited. Wind hissed under the shed doors. "At last," she said, "my brother died trying to get out through the lower harbor when Blackwater collapsed. Smugglers promised room on a convoy. They took the fuel and left half the people on the quay when the company patrol boats came." Her voice stayed level by force. "He was 16. Jonah looked at her, then away in the way decent people do when faced with pain they understand cannot be fixed by witnessing it harder. "Was Maud there?" he asked quietly. Selka shook her head once. "Not then." But women like her fed on what followed. Jonah sipped his tea, grimaced at its quality, and said, "Well, I already disliked her. Now I'll try to become tiresome about it." A sound escaped Selka that might have been a laugh if she'd allowed it more room. He leaned a shoulder against the crawler beside her. "You don't have to carry the whole coast just because it called your name." "It didn't call my name." "Maud did." "That's different." "Only slightly." Silence again. Then Jonah added, gentler, "You also don't have to prove anything to these people." Selka looked up sharply. "To them?" "No." She glanced toward the west, though the shed wall blocked it. "To myself, maybe." He accepted that. Because Jonah Wren was good at that too, accepting truths that did not improve just because he disliked them. By midnight the crawler was loaded for a second mission. More fuel. More line. Survey instruments from Voss. Explosive charges from an old quarry cache Brenner had sworn for years no longer existed. Extra lamps. Breathing cloths. Bolt cutters. 3 rifles, a shotgun, and the sort of mood that suggested diplomacy would enter the story only if lost and misinformed. Selka did not sleep. Instead she climbed the relay tower one more time. The cage at the top rocked slightly in the night wind. Rakefall glimmered below, small enough to fit under a palm if she'd been crueler and luckier than she was. She settled beside the relay panel and listened to the speaker hiss. For a long while there was only static. Then one bell. Then another. A pattern. 3 short. 1 long. Pause. She frowned and leaned closer. The relay light flickered green. Under the static, deeper than any human voice, something mechanical turned over far out beneath the basin, a massive hidden rotation like a heart attempting memory after years of stillness. Selka closed her eyes. Her father's voice came back to her with terrible clarity, lifted from some old evening on a wharf long gone. "If the bells ever ring after the sea dies, girl, don't follow them unless you're ready to learn what men buried under useful lies." She opened her eyes to the black flats and the bells moving over them like thoughts refusing to stay buried. Too late for that, she thought. At dawn they would go west again. Back to Port Mercy. Back to Maud Saren. Back to the underworks under the Dead Sea where old engines were waking and the wrong people were already listening for the next bell. Selka touched the tiny blue tin charm in her pocket, the child's gift, warm now from her hand, and looked out across the hollow sea until the first line of morning silvered the flats. Then she stood, climbed down, and went to wake the machine.